Really excited for this second talk I'm doing today. Look at this whole question of digital technology. We obviously live in a very digital world, and that's changed a whole number of things. And we're going to think about some of those things over the next 25 minutes or so. But of course, where do we begin talking about digital technology and all the issues around there? Perhaps the best place to obviously begin is actually to go back in time to the 1700s. And one fine spring morning in 1746, this gentleman, Jean-Antoine Nollet, he was a French clergyman, and he gathered 200 monks, and he lined them up in a field in a line half a mile long, and each monk was connected to his neighbour by a length of copper wire. Nollet then connected the last monk in the line to a primitive battery, causing every monk to instantly go, "Ah!" because of the electric shock that went down the line. Why did Nollet do that? Was he just some monastic masochist? No, he was doing this because, like many clergymen in the time, he was also a scientist. A lot of clergymen in this period were also experimenters in the natural sciences, and he was conducting, pardon the pun, he was conducting an experiment to see how far electricity could travel, because there was a theory building around this time among scientists that maybe electricity was the key to developing a long-distance communications network. And the research of Nollet and others like him led directly to the invention of the electric telegraph, an invention that changed human history. Because until the invention of the telegraph, information could only travel at fairly limited speeds. The fastest information could go was the speed of a running man, or a running horse, or a train, or a ship, something like that. But the telegraph suddenly meant that information could travel at the speed of electricity, and it transformed the modern world. In fact, it actually made the modern world. And you see, when technology changes, especially when communications technology changes, it changes culture. And just as the telegraph, the printing press, radio, and TV have done before them, so the invention of the computer and then the internet and digital communication have changed our world, and they have done so at lightning speed. And we are, as human beings, far more connected, of course, than ever before. Did you know that the average person in the UK spends 1/3 of their waking time on their phone? 1/3 of the waking time on the phone is the average in the UK, with an average of 3 hours spent on social networking. So those of you who check Facebook while sitting on the lavatory, you are not alone. Yet despite a few people looking very nervous, yet despite all of that connectivity, at the same time, study after study is showing that we are lonelier than ever. Recent study of university students revealed that 25% of university students report they feel lonely, quote, all the time. And 60% of university students are lonely, chronically lonely, they say, at least once a week. Whilst in the wider population, among adults in the UK as a whole, it is 20% of all adults say they struggle with loneliness, that loneliness is a real issue for them. But the question I want to think about for a few minutes is, are those things connected? Are digital technology and the increasing connectivity that we are surrounded with and the growing loneliness epidemic, as it's been described, are those two things connected? Could the many hours that we spend online be related to the struggle that many people in our society have with loneliness? And if so, what does the gospel have to say to all of this? Now, in terms of the connection between loneliness and digital technology, certainly many scientists think that there is indeed a connection. So the psychologist and best-selling writer Jonathan Haidt, very, very influential American psychologist, he is one of many researchers whose work has shown an incredibly strong connection, actually, between technology and loneliness, especially in Generation Z. That's the generation born between 1997 and 2012. I like to think of myself as late as Generation Z, just very, very, very late. But people born between 1997 and 2012, this is particularly the case with. And in a recent article he wrote in a psychology magazine on this, Jonathan quoted, with permission, an email that he'd received from a university student that I think sort of sums up a lot of the struggles that young adults particularly in our society are having right now. This student had written to him and said, my generation is incredibly isolated. We have shallow friendships and superfluous romantic relationships that are mediated and governed to a large extent by social media. There is hardly a sense of community on campus, and it's not hard to see why. Often I'll arrive too early to a lecture to find a room of 30+ students sitting together in complete silence, absorbed in their smartphones, afraid to speak and to be heard by their peers. This leads to further isolation and a weakening of self-identity and confidence, something I know because I've experienced it. And interestingly, just last week, I mentioned earlier during the talk about Solas that I'd met with a group of student leaders from some universities in London, and one of them just offhand shared a story with me of one student who'd given up on attending Christian Union because she'd been to several Christian Union meetings and had arrived early to find 12 or 13 other people all sitting around in a circle on their phones, not talking to each other. So Christians are not immune from this either. And perhaps the problem that we're wrestling with is that technology offers us a fantasy. Technology offers us the fantasy that we need never be alone, because there is always the phone in our pocket. You need never be alone because you've always got the black mirror of your phone there in your pocket. But endless connection means that many of us are now terrified of being alone. We find ourselves alone and we become anxious and fidgety and distressed. Just look at what happens in the lineup at the coffee shop. How often we've been perhaps queuing for a coffee in Costa Coffee, and people in the line, they're not talking to each other, they're just all on their phones. And I confess I'm as guilty as the next person. We don't know what to do with being alone, so we try and solve the problem with our phones. And as the journalist William Powers put it in a book he wrote on this issue a few years ago, he said, "We've effectively been living by a philosophy, albeit an unconscious one. This philosophy holds that, number one, connecting via screens is good. And number two, the more you connect, the better." I call this digital maximalism because the goal is maximum screen time. Few of us have decided this is a wise approach to life, but let's face it, this is how we've been living. Or to give you another perspective, one of the writers who's written the most on some of this in recent years is an American social psychologist called Sherry Turkle. Brilliant communicator. Sherry's interesting. She's got some kind of faith background, some kind of Jewish background, although she plays it quite lightly. But she's spent years looking at the effect that technology's had on us. And in a TED talk she gave, and if you get the notes from this talk on the email, I'll put a link to her TED talk in there for you. She suggests that our problem is, she said, quite bluntly, we are increasingly afraid of intimacy. We are increasingly afraid of intimacy as modern humans. And so we've designed technologies like social media to give us the impression of companionship without the demands of real friendship. You can have all these friends online, but they're there at your beck and call. You can turn them off when you don't want them. And that's a recipe for deepening loneliness. And in one of her more recent books that she's written on a lot of these issues, her book Reclaiming Conversation, The Power of Talk at a Digital Age, Sherry puts it this way. She says, "We say we turn to our phones when we're bored, but we often find ourselves bored because we have become accustomed to a constant feed of connection and information and entertainment. There is even a word now in the dictionary called phubbing. It means maintaining eye contact whilst texting. My students tell me they do it all the time, and it's not that hard. All this adds up to a flight from conversation, at least conversation that is open-ended and spontaneous, conversation in which we play with ideas, in which we allow ourselves to be fully present and vulnerable." But whether or not technology is a help or a hindrance when it comes to loneliness, there is a bigger question lurking behind all of this, and it's really the gospel question, and it's why we're doing a talk on technology as part of this day. You see, I introduced you earlier to the wandering question. Well, there's a great big wandering question lurking behind all of this, and it's this: have you ever wondered why we long for connection in the first place? Why is it as human beings we long for connection in the first place? Why do we struggle with loneliness? Why do we yearn for a relationship? Why do we want to feel included? Does our desire for connection and communication and intimacy with others, does that reveal something about who we really are? Think of that talk Sharon did earlier and what it means to be human. See, certainly our need for connection would rule out the ridiculous idea that we are just meat-based computers, as the scientist and artificial intelligence expert Marvin Lee Minsky once memorably put it. The brain just happens to be a meat machine. Well, if that's the case, our computers don't get lonely. You know, I don't come home one day and find my laptop sidled next to my iPad on the dining room table and cuddle up for comfort. But human beings, we need more than this. You know, despite all the talk around AI right now, and Sharon mentioned ChatGPT earlier, I tried out ChatGPT the other month, and I managed to convince it that ducks can in fact be larger than camels, and I managed to convince it that hamsters can play the guitar. I think ChatGPT still has quite a way to go, at least engaging with sarcasm. I think we are clearly more than just intelligent machines. But couldn't an atheist come along and go, well, okay, Andy, yeah, the reason that we want connection is we are just social primates. You know, we started off picking fleas off each other, and now that's evolved into a need to cooperate in community. Well, I guess my answer to that would be we're certainly not less than that, but we're certainly more than that, which is one reason why it's possible to feel alone in a crowd of people, and why we want to do far much more than just fight, flee, reproduce, or pick fleas off one another. So does that desire for deep connection, is it a signpost? Is it another of those light beams in C.S. Lewis's shed that's pointing somewhere? I think it might be. William Powers, who I mentioned earlier, and that quote earlier I gave you came from his wonderfully titled book, Hamlet's Blackberry, Building a Good Life in the Digital Age. In that book, he makes an interesting point, and he suggests that one of the reasons why that we might be nervous, people might be nervous asking questions about technology and busyness, is very quickly that opens up other troubling questions. William writes, he says, when you start wondering about your own busyness, pretty much soon you're pondering much deeper questions. Questions such as, is this the kind of life I really want? From there, it's only a short hop to the big league existential stumpers. Questions like, why are we here, and whom am I? In other words, once you start wondering, am I too busy? Am I connected too much to my phone? Once you start realizing that you're longing for connection or wrestling with loneliness, that raises the much bigger question of purpose, doesn't it? What is the purpose of a human being? Is there something that we are intended to be? And one point I'm always very keen to make when I'm talking to more secular, more hostile audiences is that purpose is really interesting, because it's purpose that enables us to tell whether something is being used in a good way or a bad way. So, for example, if you come up and talk to me during the coffee break, and I mention to you that I'm in a bit of a bad mood today, despite the fact I may look very cheerful on stage, and you say, well, why are you in a bad mood, Andy? And I say, well, 2 days ago, I bought a new watch from the jewellery store, and they ripped me off. They sold me a really bad watch. I shouldn't have bought a £1 watch from a guy with an Essex accent. And you go, well, how is it a bad watch? What's wrong with it? And you go, well, last night I was putting up shelves, and I was hammering in nails with my watch, and it broke. Well, I imagine you'd probably say a couple of things. You might say, well, firstly, would you like a number of a good therapist here in Cowplain? Because clearly you've got some issues, dude. Second thing you hope you might say is, well, Andy, you've misunderstood the purpose of a watch. The purpose of a watch is to tell the time. And we tell whether a watch is a good watch or a bad watch, not by whether you can hammer in nails with it, but by whether it tells the time well, and you would be right. So if that's the case for something as simple as a watch, what about something more complicated like a human being? What is the purpose of a human life? Because unless we can answer that, we don't know what the good life looks like. What does a life lived in a way that we will thrive look like? And how do we begin answering that question unless we know what we're here for? And I wonder if the more we know what we're here for, the more we'll be able to address these really deep pastoral questions, like the question of loneliness. See, loneliness is an interesting word. And loneliness is actually a relatively modern word. There's a really helpful writer called Faye Bound-Alberti, who wrote a little book about 2-3 years ago called A Biography of Loneliness. And in that book, she makes the point that actually the word loneliness as a negative word didn't really appear in English until the early 1800s. It's appeared in the last couple of hundred years. Before then, so yeah, people were certainly alone, but the word and the image that tended to be used was not loneliness. People tended to use the word solitude. And solitude was seen as a positive thing. It was seen as a positive thing you'd want to aspire to. You'd want some time in solitude, not negatively. So what changed? How do we go from being alone equals solitude equals good to being alone equals I'm lonely and it's bad? And what's fascinating, I don't think that Faye has any religious faith, although she's not anti to faith. She argues in that book that one cause is the loss of belief in God in a society. So that if you believe in God, then you are never alone. Because even when you are in a field with just yourself, then still you can believe that God is with you. But if that's the case, then couldn't a hypothetical atheist friend say, well, okay, so belief in God is simply a psychological crutch, just a means to get through life without, without ending up in crisis because you're just too weak to face the grim realities of the universe. Well, the problem is, of course, if you try that route, you can explain anything away using psychology, can't you? You could say if there is a God and we live in a universe with a God behind it, maybe it's atheism that's the psychological crutch. It's a psychological crutch for those who don't want to face up to the reality that there is a judge behind this world and their lives will have accountability. And I always want to say to my friends, what matters is not what makes you feel good or not feel good. What matters is true. And I want to suggest to my friends that our need for connection is a clear sign that I think there is a God behind the universe. It's also a clear, gives us also motivation for why we care about things like truth as well. But of course, when it comes to God, what really matters is which God we are talking about. You know, we live in a society in which there are dozens of conceptions of God out there, and we can't simply as Christians say God and assume that people will necessarily know what we mean. So as Christians, of course, we want to talk about the God of the Bible. And the interesting thing is, when you look at the God of the Bible and you think about this theme of loneliness and connection, you discover the Bible says some really quite profound things about God and connectivity and relationship and, in fact, loneliness. So, for example, the first thing that the Bible says is that God designed us for relationship and connectivity. He designed us for deep connection with Him and deep connection with each other. That is why our hearts are ultimately restless, why we struggle with loneliness, or why we risk damaging our relationships when we expect our friends or loved ones to play the role that God should play, when we expect our friends and loved ones to validate our entire identity. Human relationships were not intended to do that. And as the ancient African Christian Augustine famously put it over 1600 years ago, when he wrote, "Our hearts are restless until they find their heart in God." And I think many in our society are discovering exactly what he described there. Secondly, the Bible tells us that God did not create us to be robots or slaves or slightly smarter social primates, but God created us to be sons and daughters. That's, of course, the incredible invitation that God makes to us in the Bible, to be far more than just an automata, but to actually be His children. Thirdly, of course, the Bible is very honest about our problem, that we are separated from the God who loves us by our self-centeredness and our rebellion, that we've turned our backs on God, we've made ourselves the center of the entire universe, and we've tended to use other people as means rather than as ends. And the result is the brokenness and the alienation and, yes, the loneliness that many in our society feel. But then, of course, wonderfully, fourthly, the Bible tells us that though we turned our backs on God, He hasn't turned His back on us, but that He stepped into history in the person of Jesus so that we might know Him, as Romans 5 verse 8 so beautifully put it. And one of the things I always want to say to my friends when I'm having spiritual conversations is, the God of the Bible is not some abstract idea, not some concept floating around up here, actually, but the God of the Bible has feet and legs, as it were, because He stepped into history in the person of Jesus. If we want our friends to know what God is like, we need to say to them, take a look at Jesus. And when you look at Jesus, and you look at Him and His theme of relationships, you notice something interesting. Because Jesus was a person who was deeply connected. He was deeply connected to God, and he was deeply connected to others. And although Jesus was often alone, we often hear that he would go out into solitary places and pray and so on. There is only one occasion in the Gospels when we read of Jesus being lonely. Only one occasion when we're told that he was lonely. And when was that? Well, that was when he was crucified and abandoned by his friends, abandoned by his followers, and abandoned by God. And the Bible tells us that Jesus cries out from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And this is really interesting because what is going on? Well, what's going on at the heart of the Christian faith lies, doesn't it, this amazing and wonderful claim that Jesus took all of our rebellion and all of our brokenness and all of what the Bible calls sin onto his shoulders, and he gave up his connection with God so that you might enjoy connection with God. And the incredible offer at the heart of the Christian faith is that forgiveness and reconciliation and adoption into God's family as a beloved son or daughter is possible because Jesus was willing to go through true, real loneliness and do it for us. And when you are adopted into God's family, the message we can say to our friends and our family and our colleagues is you have that joy of knowing that even when you are alone, even when you are in solitude, you are never alone because God is always with you and his presence goes with you. Now, we are living in an information-saturated age. We are drowning in data, and yet we are lonelier than ever. So in that context, I am so grateful that God did not send an idea. He didn't send a download. He didn't give us an app. But in Jesus, he sent himself. And a final thought, when communication technology changes, I said at the start, it changes culture profoundly. But one of the things I find interesting, when you look through history, whenever communication culture has changed, it's often been Christians who've been at the forefront of embracing it and using it to spread the gospel. So, 2,000 years ago, some Roman artisan somewhere in the ancient world, we don't know who it was, invented this little thing called the codex. Some little Roman artisan somewhere decided that scrolls were deeply unwieldy, and if we chopped the paper up, the papyrus up into pieces, and stitched them together, we could have this thing called the codex, or the book. And that happened just around the time the Gospels were being written. And along come the first Christians and go, that is genius. That is so the technology we need to spread the story of Jesus around the ancient world. And the church was one of the early adopters of the codex over the scroll. Some 1,500 years later, a not dissimilar story happened when this guy called Gutenberg came up with his printing press in Germany, a movable type. And again, Christians were like, whoa, that's amazing. And of course, one of the first things that was printed was Gutenberg's Bible, now very well known, very famous. Christians got hold of that technology. And the same applied to telegraph and to radio and TV and in due time, the internet, as Christians and the church have gone, hey, this is great. This is a way that we can communicate the message of Jesus more effectively. Christians have been at our best when we haven't stuck our heads in the sand. We've gone, wow, here is a way we can disseminate the good news of the gospel. But also, at the same time we've been at our best, we've also helped people ask the right questions about the technology. You see, the internet has changed the world faster than any invention to date. And now the church, the digital church, we need to help people think a bit more reflectively about that. We need to think hard about this digital world we live in. We need to think missionally and biblically and evangelistically, not just so we can use the communication technology well. Our job is not simply to go, how do we make the world's coolest recordings of our sermons so they'll go viral? We've also got to think about how do we help people ask the right questions about the challenges of the digital age that we're in. And we also need to be equipped to answer the questions people are asking. Because there are no simple answers when it comes to digital technology, or the profound questions it raises about things like personhood and busyness and identity and tribalism. Some of the questions and the conversations we should have with our friends and family and colleagues probably revolve around what the good life looks like. If we are living in a digital culture that's even at risk at times of becoming a digital cage, if we're living in a culture that doesn't quite support the things as humans that we value and treasure, then it's vital that all of us, but especially we Christians whom God has called to be about kingdom values, that we are starting conversations about how that culture can be rebuilt and reshaped. And in a world of crazy, crazy busyness, where many of us and our friends are driven mad with the amount of information, notifications, bings, bong, beeps, tweets, and everything else, perhaps we need to remind our friends of the incredible promise of Jesus that I hold to when I'm having a particularly bad digital day. Because Jesus said, "Come to me, all of you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest." And in a world that is looking for rest from digital noise, the gospel stands unique in the offer that it makes. Thanks for listening.